The radio shouldn't have been on. Batteries had been pulled 3 hours earlier. Standard procedure. Night watch protocols in forward positions. Remove power sources. Prevent signal leaks. Maintain silence. The equipment sat cold on the wooden table. Wires disconnected. Casing open. But at 0317 hours, static filled the room. Not loud. A whisper of white noise, barely audible over the wind pressing against sandbag walls. The Marine on duty didn't move at first, didn't reach for it. He sat in darkness, watching the dead radio produce sound that shouldn't exist. The static shaped itself, became rhythm, became voice. Russian, fragmented, desperate. Coordinates 04 need extraction. He checked the battery compartment again. Empty. He traced every wire with his flashlight. Nothing connected. The voice continued, clearer now, repeating numbers that matched something he'd seen earlier that day on a map reference, a location less than 300 meters from where he sat. The transmission ended with a sound like distant gunfire, then silence. When his watch relief arrived 30 minutes later, the radio was exactly as he'd found it, powerless, disassembled, and cold to the touch. But the voice had been real. If you value the research and care behind this kind of historical storytelling, consider subscribing. These accounts take time to verify and present responsibly. Your support makes that possible. Afghanistan's Helmand province occupies a peculiar position in military history. For decades, foreign forces have established observation posts across its desert valleys, each generation building upon ruins left by the last. The terrain itself seems to resist permanence. Ancient mud structures crumble into sand, metal corrodes rapidly in temperature extremes, and anything buried tends to resurface during seasonal floods. In 2009, U.S. Marine Corps units rotating into the region took control of dozens of these positions. One, designated Observation Point Rock, sat elevated above the desert floor in Kajaki District. The location offered clear sight lines across approaching valleys, making it strategically valuable. It was also built partially atop the remnants of older fortifications, British colonial structures from the 19th century, and beneath those, foundations dating back centuries. The Marines who arrived in early spring that year were not the first to occupy the specific position recently. British forces had maintained a presence there during earlier phases of the conflict, and Soviet units had operated from nearby positions during the 1980s. This layering of military presence created unusual conditions. Communication equipment from different eras sometimes left buried debris, old cables, discarded radio components, metal stakes used for antenna rays. Standard operating procedure required Marines to establish reliable communications immediately upon occupying any position. Radio equipment was tested repeatedly, frequencies logged, backup systems verified. In isolated observation posts, communication represented the only connection to supporting units. Equipment failure could prove fatal. The radio systems used by Marine units in 2009 were sophisticated by historical standards, and /PRC 117F multiband radios could operate across numerous frequencies, both line of sight and satellite linked. They included encryption, frequency hopping capabilities, and redundant power systems. These weren't Vietnam-era field radios prone to atmospheric interference. They were digital systems designed specifically to prevent signal contamination. Yet radio communication in Afghanistan presented unique challenges. The mountainous terrain created dead zones where signals bounced unpredictably. Temperature inversions could bend radio waves, causing them to travel farther than normal or reflect off atmospheric layers. Dust storms generated static. Soviet-era equipment, some of it still buried or abandoned, occasionally produced electromagnetic interference when corroded batteries leaked. The Marine station at Opie Rock in spring 2009 maintained communication protocols strictly, hourly check-ins, equipment inspections, battery rotations. The isolation of their position meant any communication breakdown required immediate attention. During the first 2 weeks, operations proceeded normally, Radio traffic consisted of routine reports, weather observations, movement patterns in distant villages, supply requests. Night watches rotated every 4 hours. Daytime temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but nights dropped below freezing. This temperature differential affected equipment performance, requiring constant monitoring. The outpost itself was Spartan. Sandbag walls reinforced with scavenged timber, a covered observation platform. Sleeping quarters dug partially into the hillside for temperature regulation and protection. 6 Marines rotated duty at any given time, with relief units arriving every 6 weeks. Water was rationed. Food was pre-packaged. Sleep was irregular. These conditions were standard for forward positions, unremarkable by military standards. Hundreds of similar outposts dotted the Afghan landscape, each operating under comparable circumstances. What made Opie Rock unusual, initially, were comments passed along during the relief in-place briefing. British soldiers rotating out mentioned that local contractors had refused to work on certain sections of the position. They'd also noted equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained by normal, where batteries draining faster than expected in specific locations, inexplicable interference on certain frequencies at particular times. These observations were filed as anecdotal, not formally reported, not investigated. Military operations in austere environments generate countless small anomalies that never warrant official attention. Equipment fails. Locals hold superstitions. Soldiers experience stress. The Marine unit settling into Opie Rock had no reason to consider these informal warnings significant. They conducted their own equipment checks, found everything functional, and began their rotation. For the first 15 days, nothing unusual occurred. The Afghan landscape surrounding the outpost was ancient beyond easy comprehension. Archaeological surveys conducted decades earlier had identified the area as containing Bronze Age settlements, Persian-era trading posts, and countless unexcavated ruins. The hill itself showed signs of human occupation stretching back millennia. Every military force that had passed through this region had noticed the same strategic value: elevation, visibility, defensive advantage. And every force had left something behind. British rifle casings from the 1800s occasionally surfaced. Soviet ammunition crates, rusted and empty, littered a ravine 200 meters south. Even older artifacts, pottery shards, worked stone, corroded metal, emerged whenever Marines dug new fighting positions. This layering of history was unremarkable in Afghanistan. The entire country functioned as an archaeological site where every shovel of earth might reveal a previous century. What nobody mentioned in formal briefings, but what appeared in personal letters and informal conversations, was a consistent pattern. Afghan locals avoided this particular hill after dark. Not all hills, not all old military positions. This specific location. When asked, they would offer vague explanations about respect for the dead, or mention that many soldiers died here, or simply indicate it was not a good place to be at night. These statements weren't dramatic or supernatural in tone. They were matter of fact, the way someone might mention a road prone to flooding. Official records noted Soviet casualties in the general area during the 1980s. British colonial records mentioned skirmishes in the Kajaki region. But these were broad historical facts, not site-specific documentation. The Marines at Opie Rock were aware of this history academically. The way any soldier understands that ground contested for centuries carries weight. They were not, however, prepared for what that history might mean practically. The first report came during week 3. It was logged informally, not as an incident but as a maintenance note. A Marine performing evening radio checks described brief interference on a specific frequency, approximately 45.5 megahertz, which fell outside their normal operational band. The interference lasted perhaps 20 seconds, consisted of what he described as voice-like static, and then ceased. He noted it primarily because the radio had been powered down at the time. When questioned, he clarified, the radio was in standby mode, conserved battery, but maintained time synchronization. It shouldn't have produced audio output. Yet he'd heard something through the speaker before the unit was fully activated. When he powered it up completely to investigate, the interference had stopped. This was recorded as potential equipment malfunction. The radio was tested, found functional, and returned to service. 3 days later, a different Marine on night watch reported similar interference. Same approximate frequency, same brief duration. This time he described it more specifically. Syllables, not English, possibly Russian, though his familiarity with the language was limited. 2 reports of similar phenomena by different personnel warranted attention. The unit's communications specialist conducted a frequency sweep, checking for civilian broadcasts, commercial transmissions, or military traffic that might explain the interference. Afghanistan's radio spectrum was crowded with traffic from multiple coalition forces, Afghan military, civilian stations, and occasionally unauthorized broadcasts. The sweep revealed nothing on 45.5 megahertz. The frequency was essentially dead air. At this point, the reports might have been dismissed as misheard civilian radio or atmospheric ducting, a known phenomenon where radio waves bend through temperature layers and arrive from unexpected distances. Soviet-era stations, operating hundreds of miles away, occasionally produced ghost signals in Afghanistan's mountains. But then the pattern became more specific. Multiple Marines began reporting the same interference, always at night, always between 0300 and 0330 hours. Not every night, perhaps every third or fourth night, and always brief, never more than 30 to 40 seconds. The content of the transmissions, as described by those who heard them, remained consistent. A male voice speaking Russian, repeating what sounded like coordinates or numerical sequences, occasionally saying words that resembled help or evacuation. One Marine, who'd studied Russian in high school, wrote down phonetic approximations of what he heard. Another recorded the audio on a personal device during one transmission. When reviewed later, the recording contained only static. Whatever the Marines heard directly was not being captured electronically. This discrepancy raised questions. If the phenomenon was genuine radio interference, it should record. If it was auditory hallucination, multiple people shouldn't describe identical content. The situation fell into an uncomfortable middle ground between explainable and inexplicable. During this period, a separate incident occurred. Marines expanding defensive positions began unearthing metal objects, not recent trash, but older equipment. Specifically, they found Soviet radio equipment, damaged receivers, corroded batteries, cable spools marked with Cyrillic lettering. This wasn't unusual. Soviet forces had operated throughout Helmand province during their decade-long occupation. Abandoned equipment was common, but the concentration of communication equipment in this specific location was notable. It suggested a Soviet communication position had existed on or near this site. Further excavation revealed more. Metal stakes arranged in patterns consistent with antenna arrays, fragments of solar panels, and beneath a partially collapsed structure, human remains. The remains were not recent. Clothing fragments suggested Soviet military uniforms. Bone condition indicated decades of exposure. The discovery was reported through appropriate channels, cataloged, and the area was marked off as containing potential unexploded ordnance, standard procedure when encountering old military sites. Afghan workers contracted to assist with construction confirmed what Marines had begun to suspect. This location had been a Soviet observation post in the early 1980s. Local memory held that something had happened there, an attack, a massacre. Accounts varied, and that most of the Soviet personnel stationed there had been killed. Official Soviet records from the period were incomplete, but cross-referencing available documents suggested a unit had indeed been stationed in this area and had reported coming under attack before communication ceased. The transmission dates coincided with early 1984. Radio communication at its core is electromagnetic radiation propagating through space. Signals broadcast from a transmitter travel as waves, bouncing off terrain, bending through atmospheric layers, reflecting off the ionosphere. Under normal conditions, these signals dissipate according to predictable physics. But atmospheric conditions can create anomalies. Temperature inversions, layers of warm air sitting atop cold air, act like reflective surfaces for radio waves. Signals that should travel line of sight can be bent hundreds of miles beyond their intended range. During certain atmospheric conditions, radio transmissions from Europe have been received in North America despite the curvature of the Earth. This phenomenon, called tropospheric ducting, occurs regularly. Amateur radio operators rely on it to make long-distance contacts. Military communication specialists account for it in planning. It's established physics, not speculation. A related phenomenon involves delayed signal propagation. Radio waves can, under specific conditions, circle the Earth multiple times via ionospheric reflection before dissipating. This means a transmission made at one time could, theoretically, be received minutes or even hours later as the signal completes its journey through the atmosphere. These scientific explanations provide comfortable frameworks for understanding phantom radio transmissions. A Soviet communication from 1984 entering a specific atmospheric condition might propagate unpredictably, bouncing between ionospheric layers, persisting longer than normal, and eventually reaching equipment tuned to the same frequency decades later. This explanation has precedent. Researchers have documented cases of radio operators receiving distorted transmissions that were traced back to broadcasts made hours or days earlier, circling the globe via atmospheric reflection. However, this explanation requires certain conditions. The original transmission must have been powerful enough to enter the ionosphere. The atmospheric conditions must be precise. The receiving equipment must be tuned to the exact frequency, and the phenomenon should be random, not patterned. The transmissions at Opie Rock violated several of these requirements. First, they occurred at consistent times, between 0300 and 0330 hours, rather than randomly. Atmospheric ducting doesn't follow schedules. Second, they occur regardless of weather conditions. Temperature inversions strong enough to cause extreme ducting correlate with specific meteorological patterns. Yet the transmissions happen during clear nights, overcast nights, windy nights, and calm nights with equal frequency. Third, and most problematically, they were heard on equipment that was powered down. Radio receivers require electrical power to convert electromagnetic waves into audio. A powered-down radio should be as inert as a rock, incapable of producing sound regardless of what signals pass through the air around it. Unless something else was occurring, alternative explanations began circulating among the Marines, though never formally. One hypothesis suggested that old Soviet equipment, still powered by corroding batteries, was somehow producing residual transmissions. Chemical reactions in decaying batteries can generate small amounts of electricity for years, potentially enough to activate damaged transmitters intermittently. This would explain localized transmissions. It would explain consistency of location. But it wouldn't explain why multiple receivers, some powered down, detected the same content simultaneously. It also wouldn't explain why the transmissions, if originating from damaged equipment, sounded clear rather than distorted. Another hypothesis involved geological factors. Certain rock formations contain quartz and other minerals capable of piezoelectric effects, generating small electrical charges under mechanical stress. In theory, seismic activity or thermal expansion could cause buried equipment to receive small charges, possibly activating it intermittently. This remains speculation. No seismic activity was recorded during transmission events. And even if buried equipment somehow activated, it should produce random noise, not coherent voice transmissions in Russian. A psychological explanation was also considered. Extended isolation, sleep deprivation, and stress can produce auditory hallucinations. Multiple people in close quarters might influence each other, creating shared perceptual experiences. The human brain, seeking patterns in white noise, can construct voice-like sounds from random static. This explanation had merit. Military psychologists have documented cases of shared auditory experiences in isolated units. However, such experiences typically involve ambiguous stimuli, indistinct sounds interpreted as voices. They don't usually involve multiple trained personnel independently describing identical, specific content in a foreign language, particularly when some listeners had enough language background to phonetically transcribe what they heard. Each explanation addressed some aspects of the phenomenon while failing to account for others. What remained consistent across all reports was the content of the transmissions. The voice, described universally as male, urgent but not panicked, professional. Repeated coordinates that, when plotted, indicated locations within 300 meters of Opie Rock. It requested evacuation. It mentioned being trapped or surrounded, though the exact phrasing varied depending on which Marine heard which transmission, and it always ended the same way, with a sound described variously as static burst, as distant automatic weapons fire, or as both simultaneously, a sound that might have been gunfire, or might have been the audio distortion of a transmission abruptly severed. After that sound, the transmission ceased until the next occurrence. Days later, always in the same time window, always saying essentially the same things. The Marines stopped logging these incidents officially. What could they report? Equipment that functioned normally except when it didn't? They continued their mission, and they continued to hear the voice. Lance Corporal Martinez drew night watch on April 17th. His shift began at 0200 and would run until 0600. Standard 4-hour rotation. He'd done this 40 times since arriving at Opie Rock, enough that the routine had become automatic. Check in with command. Verify radio function. Log weather conditions. Maintain observation. Stay alert. The night was cold, as all nights were. Clear sky. Half moon, visibility good. He could see the valley floor stretching south, dark except for occasional lights from distant compounds. Wind moved across the hilltop steadily, creating white noise that made other sounds difficult to distinguish. At 0240, he conducted scheduled radio check. Command responded immediately. Signal clear. Equipment was functioning normally. He logged the check and resumed observation. At some point after 0300, he didn't note the exact time. He became aware that the radio was producing sound despite not being keyed. Not loud, a low hiss of static that shouldn't have been there when no transmission was active. He turned to look at the equipment. The radio sat on its mount, indicator lights showing normal standby status, but the speaker was emitting low-level noise. Martinez wasn't alarmed. Equipment acted strangely sometimes. He reached over to adjust the squelch control, which regulates how much background noise the speaker outputs. Before he touched the control, the static resolved into voice, not English. The syllables were wrong, the rhythm different. He recognized it as Russian. He'd heard enough Russian speakers in training videos to identify the language, though he couldn't understand it. The voice was clear. Adult male, speaking steadily, not shouting, but with urgency. Martinez reached the handset to respond, following protocol for unexpected transmissions, but hesitated. Something about the voice's tone stopped him. It wasn't addressing him. It was broadcasting, repeating something. Numbers, he thought. Coordinates, maybe. He grabbed a pen and started writing down the sounds phonetically, trying to capture what he was hearing. His Russian was non-existent, but he could approximate. Vozimvism nuza evakuatsiya. The transmission continued for perhaps 30 seconds. The voice repeated the same information twice, then said something else, a longer sentence Martinez couldn't parse. And then there was a sound. He would later describe this sound to others who asked, and his description would remain consistent. It sounded like a radio being keyed off abruptly, while simultaneous bursts of automatic weapons fire occurred in the background. Not close fire, distant, several hundred meters maybe. The type of sound you'd hear if someone was transmitting during a firefight happening nearby. Then silence. Complete silence. Even the background static ceased. Martinez sat motionless for several seconds, pen still in hand. Then he keyed his radio. Any station, this is Opie Rock, radio check. Command responded immediately. Opie Rock, read you 5x5. Did you just transmit anything to my position? Negative. Last transmission from us was your scheduled check at 0240. Did you receive any transmission from me in the last 2 minutes? Negative. Opie Rock. You've been silent since 0240. Martinez looked at his watch. 0317 hours. He considered reporting what he'd heard, but stopped. What would he say? That he'd heard a Russian voice on a radio that wasn't receiving Russian frequencies? That nobody else had transmitted, but he'd heard someone anyway? Copy that, command. Opie Rock out. He spent the next 20 minutes examining the radio equipment. Frequency settings were unchanged. The radio was tuned to military frequencies only, encrypted channels that civilian or foreign military transmissions shouldn't penetrate. He checked for crossband interference. Found none. He tested the speaker by adjusting volume, heard nothing but normal static variation. The equipment was functioning exactly as designed. At 0400, Corporal Davis arrived for shift overlap. Standard procedure to have 15 minutes of dual coverage during watch changes. Martinez briefed him on the observation log, weather, and radio checks. He didn't mention the transmission, but at 0415, while both were present, the radio emitted static again. Davis heard it too. He looked at Martinez, then at the radio. Did command just transmit? Martinez checked the encryption key indicator. No, this is something else. The voice began again. Same tone, same language. Davis's eyes widened. Is that Russian? Yeah. They listened. The voice repeated the pattern Martinez had heard earlier. Numbers, what sounded like coordinates, then a phrase that might have been requesting extraction. Then that same abrupt ending, the sound of weapons fire and sudden silence. Davis reached for the handset. Martinez stopped him. Wait. We need to report this. Report what? That we're both hearing things. This isn't hearing things. This is actual transmission. Through encrypted military frequencies? In Russian? From who? Davis had no answer. They sat in silence for a moment, then conducted their watch change procedures normally. Martinez briefed him fully on the log and departed for his sleeping position. He didn't sleep. He lay in darkness, listening to other Marines breathing in nearby positions, and thought about the sound of distant gunfire at the end of that transmission. Over the next week, every Marine at Opie Rock would eventually hear similar transmissions. Not all simultaneously, not predictably, but each would eventually experience the same phenomenon. Russian voice, urgent tone, coordinates an evacuation request, ending with gunfire and silence. Some heard it through active radios during scheduled transmissions with command. The Russian voice would overlap with the American voice briefly, creating jarring dual audio before command's transmission continued normally. Command never heard the Russian voice. Only the Marines at Opie Rock did. Others heard it through powered-down radios during equipment maintenance. One Marine reported hearing it through his helmet-mounted communication system while on observation, even though that system operated on completely different frequencies and technology than the base radios. The phenomenon didn't correlate with any known radio traffic. Signals intelligence specialists at headquarters were quietly asked to monitor the frequency spectrum around Opie Rock. They detected nothing unusual. The Marines began comparing notes informally. Everyone who heard the transmission described the same content. Numbers that, when plotted, indicated positions very close to Opie Rock, requests for evacuation or help, and that terminal sound of gunfire. One Marine plotted all the coordinates mentioned across multiple transmissions. They formed a rough circle around the hillside, with the center point located almost exactly where Soviet remains had been discovered weeks earlier. Nobody officially reported the transmissions as supernatural or unexplainable. What they reported carefully was equipment malfunction, possible atmospheric interference, need for frequency reallocation. But among themselves, they acknowledged something else was occurring, something that wanted to be heard. The Marine unit rotated out of Opie Rock in late summer 2009. Their relief, A fresh unit with no knowledge of what previous occupants had experienced took over position and maintained it for another 6 months before coalition forces consolidated positions and Opie Rock was abandoned. Records from that second unit's rotation contain brief mentions of radio irregularities. Nothing detailed, nothing officially investigated, just maintenance notes about interference and equipment checks. By 2011, Opie Rock was no longer occupied. The strategic situation had shifted, observation posts were being reduced, and the hill returned to silence. What remains is testimony, written statements from multiple Marines describing identical experiences, separated by time and watch rotation, each hearing the same voice saying the same things. These statements exist in personal accounts, in informal interviews, in letters home that mention weird radio stuff without elaboration. The explanation that satisfies science suggests atmospheric anomaly, signal propagation from distant sources, or equipment malfunction amplified by environmental stress and psychological factors. These explanations are reasonable. They account for most aspects of the phenomenon, but they don't account for the specificity. They don't explain why multiple people heard identical content. They don't address why powered-down equipment produced audio. They don't clarify why the coordinates mentioned in transmissions pointed to locations where Soviet soldiers had died decades earlier. Those who experience the transmissions directly tend to avoid definitive explanation. When asked what they think they heard, most respond carefully. "I don't know" is the most common answer. Some add that they heard something real that wasn't imagination, but they can't explain what it was. A few mention that it felt like listening to something that had happened in the past, still occurring somehow, a moment trapped and replaying. Others suggested strong emotional events, fear, desperation, violent death. Might leave impressions in places, though they acknowledge this sounds unscientific. No one claims certainty. What's documented is pattern. Different people, different times, same experience. That pattern resists easy dismissal, but also resists definitive explanation. The human brain constructs narratives. Given incomplete information, it fills gaps with story. Soldiers in isolated positions, aware they're occupying ground where others died violently, might unconsciously create shared experiences that validate their unease. This is known psychology. But psychology doesn't usually create specific, repeated verbal content in a foreign language that multiple witnesses can phonetically transcribe with matching results. Opie Rock sits empty now. The sandbag walls have collapsed. Wind moves through abandoned positions. The hill appears as it did before any modern military force arrived. Ancient, silent, bearing no obvious mark of recent occupation. Local Afghans still avoid it after dark. Not dramatically. Not with stories of ghosts or hauntings. They simply prefer to pass by during daylight. And when asked why, they mention it's not a good place, that too many have died there over too many years, that some places carry weight. Whether that weight is metaphorical or literal remains unanswered. The Marines who served at Opie Rock continue their lives and careers. Most don't discuss what they experienced. A few have shared accounts in forums dedicated to military experiences, posting anonymously, seeking not attention but confirmation from others who might have heard the same thing. And occasionally, someone responds, "I was there, I heard it too." The transmissions at Opie Rock occurred. Multiple witnesses confirm this. Equipment functioned normally except when it didn't. Scientific explanation remains incomplete. Some things resist resolution. Some voices, perhaps, refuse silence.